It looked like somebody was bent over and had their head in the window of the deer blind. It either heard me or smelt me, and he pulled his head out of the tent and stood straight up, and that shocked me. They don't make people that big.
The way it moved, almost as if it was gliding across the beach. I've never seen anything move like that in my life. They were screaming at each other in gibberish. It sounded like a language, and they were chuntering away back and forwards, back and forwards, back and forwards. I know what a bear looks like, and there is no way on this planet that what I saw were bears.
What are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
Gia!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
Hey, this is Kason from East Tennessee, and you're listening to Sasquatch Chronicles.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you. We're going to be chatting with Matt. And 8 years ago, Matt was out on the property and had a strange run-in with a creature out there. He didn't really believe in Bigfoot prior to this, but he had no explanation for what he saw. So we'll be going into that tonight, along with some vocalizations. And speaking of vocalizations, there was a listener that sent this to me. This happened in April of 2021 in Maine. He was out with his family and was doing some tree knocking and got a strange response. So let's take a listen.
That is not an owl.
Shh. Get off the rock, and you guys.
Did you not just hear that?
Yeah, I did hear it. I'm not.
I just did some tree knocking. Now all of a sudden it's loud again. Stop.
Very cool. And I put this up on Sasquatch Chronicles, up on the blog. If you want to listen to it again. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Matt to the show. Matt, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
The pleasure's mine having you on, Matt, and I'm fascinated by your encounter because from talking to you, I know you weren't really into Sasquatch, Bigfoot. No one really in your family was, and you and your dad kind of joked about things at times. But if you would, tell me a little bit about this property out there in Connecticut. Is it a family property that you guys own?
Yeah, so it's been in my family for close to 300 years now at this point. All farmland. My grandfather was a farmer. He kind of did, not like specifically dairy or meat. He kind of did a little bit of everything. So, he had cows, he had horses. Don't know if he had like pigs, and then he had his crops with silos and stuff like that. So it was active farmland for quite some time. He passed before I was born. And that's when my dad inherited the property. And my dad grew up a farmer, but didn't really have much interest in continuing farming. So at that point, we pretty much stopped all sort of farming and just kind of had the land. And when my grandfather owned it, he at one time had close to 300 something acres. Then around the time of my sighting, we were down to about 36. We kind of gave some to the town, gave some to the Nature Conservancy, donated some to the state. And so we were down to about 36 acres, most of which is field. And then part of it is a wooded area. There's a pretty prominent river / lake about a mile downhill from I kind of sit on top of a hill. And so you have the field, which is probably, I'd say, 20 to 25 acres, and then woods for, the next 10 to, or 5 to 10. And then you probably have about, I don't know, maybe, less than a mile till you get to this pretty major waterway.
Sounds nice. Sounds really nice. And I appreciate you kind of giving us a description of this property. And there's a lot of places in Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, when you get outside of the cities that, if you can look at pictures of it, and if you told me it's Washington State, I'd probably believe you. Beautiful and lush, and sounds like a really nice property. Being that your family has owned this property for so long, was there anyone else throughout your life, like your grandfather or anyone else on the property that talked about seeing weird things or hearing odd noises?
I don't remember my dad specifically saying anything about my grandfather having any sort of experiences, but my dad had, we were talking about Bigfoot one day in kind of a joking manner. And it was prior to my experience and the research I've done. And, I kind of just laughed at it, but he was being serious, like that kind of, it was like a joking conversation. And he's like, "Oh no, I've seen one." I was like, "Wait, what?" He's like, "Yeah, I've seen one." And then we kind of like moved on. And so after my experience, I went back and, asked a little bit more.
I hear ya. Well, we'll come back to that conversation. And I understand why people joke around about it. It sounds ridiculous until you see it. So I completely get it. So in 2014, you're out on the property. If you would just kind of tell us what you were doing and walk us into what happened.
All right. So, regular day, nothing out of the unusual. It was early evening, and we had a golden retriever. She was out doing her thing. She started barking like crazy. So I said, "All right, I got to get the dog in." And when I walked outside, so when you walk out of my house, we had like a patio and then a little bit of field and a pool house area. And that's all fenced in. And behind that's all the old farmland. And she never had gone back there, and she was kind of standing at that back fence, like barking, which was weird. So I had walked down there, and I noticed a group of deer, running like crazy across the field, like they were being chased. And I looked behind them, and that's when I saw what I believe to have been a Bigfoot. It just kind of running after them, and the grass was probably between 4 to 5 foot at the time, and this thing was towering above it. I saw from about the waist up. It was moving quickly like it was running, but this isn't field that's been maintained, so there's a lot of brambles, small saplings of trees. It's not something that a human could easily run through, like without hesitation or without even like maybe a machete or something. And this thing was just going after the deer, and then they kind of disappeared into the woods there. And I just kind of like I sat there in awe. Like, did I just see what I think I saw? And I don't think I even really believed it at first. I was like, oh, that must have been a bear. But I was like, no way, that thing was clearly upright. It shocked me how easily it was moving through the land. And you had that one episode, or actually I've heard it in a couple of your episodes, where people refer to the movement as kind of like one of those moving escalators in the airport that you like walk on, where it's almost just like it was gliding along. And it was really, really, really odd. And it scared me because it was a big animal. And we see a good amount of black bear. Where I'm at, we actually have a very high population of black bear, and I had never seen a black bear like this. The other thing that set it aside was the color. Black bears are obviously, they're black, and you can see that, they're black. This thing was clearly like a dark brown. You could almost see kind of like like it had like a couple shades of brown in it. Like it wasn't just one solid color, like a black bear. And so that was the first experience that summer.
Yeah, I would imagine that would have been eye-opening. How far away from you was this thing running down the deer?
If I had to guess, I'd say maybe 100 to 200 feet. It was close, but not, where I felt like I was personally in danger. I don't even think the thing noticed that I was there. It was almost like unfazed.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, especially for hunters. People have been out their whole life and they see something like this. They immediately think black bear, but the math isn't adding up as far as what they're seeing. And so they're really thrown off by it. I realize all of this is happening very, very quickly. Was there any details that you remember kind of stick with you from looking at this thing?
It didn't look like me, like to me, when like people run their arms are kind of up by their side, or even that kind of like ridiculous speed walking where you get the really exaggerated arm pumps. It wasn't anything like that. Like the arms were moving back and forth, but it was like low. They weren't raised up. I did notice, very, very broad shoulders. And it did have sort of like a hunch, not like a slouch. Like it wasn't like it had bad posture. It just seemed like that's how the build was. Like its head was slightly forward, and it came to a very like broad front. And then, I couldn't make out like a nose or ears or anything like that.
A lot of different eyewitnesses will say, it wasn't really slouched over, but they do kind of have a weird, like a hunch over when you see them upright. I know there's another sighting we're going to talk about, and I'm going to play this piece of audio you sent me. Before we get into that, at this point, did you go talk to your dad, or was it much later?
No, so this was actually when I approached my dad, because I remembered. I was like, okay, maybe he wasn't joking. And at that time, I started digging pretty heavily into sightings, and a lot of them do come from out your way. You don't get too many over here in my neck of the woods. So, I started digging a lot, and I've actually found that the county I'm in has the highest sighting reports in Connecticut. And that was kind of a little bit more like, okay, maybe I did see a Sasquatch. And so I asked my dad about this, about his report. And he used to go snapping turtle fishing with his grandfather. Just down the road, a little bit closer to the lake, there's a little pond, and it's kind of buried in the woods. You gotta hike to get in there. And they were out in a little skiff fishing for snapping turtles, which I don't know how you do that. I've never done that. But he said that they saw something moving through the woods with ease, and it kind of stopped and peered out behind a tree and looked at them, and then moved on, kind of just like, didn't make any sounds or didn't like, bluff charge like some people talk about. It just sort of disappeared as quickly as it appeared. He said that he was terrified, and he remembers he remembers seeing this thing upright on two legs. I think he said his grandfather just tried to, say, "Oh no, that was just a bear. It's okay. Can't hurt us. We're in a boat." But my dad remembered, and you could see in his face when he was telling the story, just that fear that he experienced. And that's when I knew that, okay, he clearly saw something that was unusual and not normal for this area.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how conversations always kind of start out in a joking manner, and how they kind of evolve. When your dad told you that, I mean, what was this conversation like when your dad told you this, and then you told him what happened to you?
I think at first he kind of thought I was just like, I was joking, kind of playing off of the conversation we had previous, whatever that was. But then, and I told him, I was like, no, I'm serious. I think I just saw this. That's when he said, I believe you, and shared his sighting. And, he also said, strange sounds that he couldn't identify. And, I could just tell the sincerity in his eyes when he was telling me that story. And, you could physically see the emotion coming back to him. And that was kind of like you saw you saw a Bigfoot,
Yeah, that's cool that you and your dad had a chance to kind of talk about it. Makes a big difference when, someone believes you and they go, I believe what you saw, as opposed to cracking jokes. This wasn't your only sighting, though. I know you had another sighting on the property. If you would tell us about it, when did the next sighting occur?
Maybe like 2 months afterwards. So still the same summer. We have a barn that has a elevated, like a second story deck, and we chopped the railings off of it and made it into like a driving range. So we used to just hit golf balls into the back field. A buddy of mine and I were sitting there just hitting golf balls, listening to music, and out of the trees came this thing, kind of meandered out, and then I think it kind of became aware of our presence there because we had music going and hitting golf balls its way, and it kind of looked up at us, looked around, and then like just retreated back into the woods. I pointed it out to my buddy. I was like, "Hey, do you see that over there? Like, that's not. What is that?" And so we kind of sat there and watched it for a little while. It was like one of those things where the two of us looked at each other and were like puzzled. Like, did that really just happen? And I told him about the experience I had a month prior. He didn't believe me at first, and I said, well, the thing is brown, right? He goes, yeah. I was like, it was on two legs, right? Yeah. What do you think it was? And he couldn't really come up with anything that he wasn't like, oh, well, it must have been a bear. And that's that's the only thing really in this region that you could possibly confuse a Sasquatch with, is the black bear. We don't have any other kind of bear here. The only other real predators we have, coyotes and occasional wolf, bobcat, but nothing that size. This thing was huge. I used the grass as a kind of a scale again. I mean, the grass was still about that 5 foot range. We didn't hay it, and this thing, had to be another 5 foot above that. It was just massive.
Yeah, sounds like it was. So you guys are hitting golf balls on the property, and this thing walks out and kind of looks in your general direction. How far away from you was this thing when it came out of the wood line?
This was he came out of the woods, so like the very end of the field. It was probably like a football, like a football field, like 100 yards or so.
Can I ask you, did it look like the same one you saw before? I mean, I know you don't know if it's the same one or not, but did it kind of look like the same one you saw before?
Yeah, the size seemed, approximately the same. And, I have a hard time believing there's any sort of family group in that area. I think one could get away with, hanging around a little bit and, have enough room to kind of not be seen. But I think multiple would have caused an uproar. So I do believe it was the same one.
Yeah, and seeing this thing second time around, was there any details that stood out to you?
Not particularly as much as the first. It was quite a bit further away, but just the size for sure. It was huge. The broadness of its shoulders, like how wide it was at the shoulders. If I had to guess, it was anywhere between 3.5 to 4.5 foot wide at the shoulders. And, that's really all I could, I couldn't see any facial attributes from that range. I didn't have any binoculars on me or anything like that. So, I didn't get a great look at it, but it came out long enough to observe to observe it and to make the connection to the previous sighting I had.
Yeah, I hear you. I was curious if you had noticed anything different kind of the second time around. And, Matt, Sasquatch's behavior really, it's bizarre to me. A lot of people, they'll say it's an elusive animal and blah, 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 blah. But, what's strange is in a lot of, like roadside crossings, for example, they'll step in front of people's cars, which is strange to me. And this behavior is very strange to me. It's kind of like, it's not really aggressive. It kind of reminds me of like a bum or like an old man coming out being like, the hell you guys doing over there? That's kind of the impression I get when I hear this encounter. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I felt like it was a grumpy old man, like coming out, like, what the hell are you doing? Like you're disturbing me, like came out, and it kind of had this like disgusted kind of movement to it, and then it just kind of moseyed back into the woods. And it's interesting because you do hear the stories of people being bluff charged and aggressive behavior, and there wasn't really anything aggressive about this behavior. It was more of just kind of a checking out to see what was going on.
Have you ever looked around the property to see if there was anything weird or strange?
So I have, I spent a lot of time in those woods when I was younger, hiking around, but I don't really ever remember finding any sort of I never saw a footprint, nothing, too strange. We ran into a coyote den one time, which was a little terrifying, but, yeah. And so we actually the next day had gone down there to kind of investigate a little bit. And, we didn't see anything too out of the ordinary. I do remember seeing kind of right where it came out is where we aimed to go in. And there was a couple branches that were probably, almost 10 foot up that had been kind of snapped, like something had moved them to get through. And the height of that was pretty, to see that, like something cleared its own path, to kind of come out and see what was going on. That was really the only thing I remember seeing. We didn't see anything, any carcasses of animals or anything like that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you guys went to investigate. A lot of times people don't. I get why they don't, but it's nice to hear that you went looking for evidence of what you're seeing, and all of this is happening in a short period of time. from your first encounter to your second one. I know it was a few months, but it was relatively close together. You sent me this piece of audio. It's weird. It kind of reminds me of a pig, but not really. Where did you record this at? Was this on the property? Kind of tell me about how you came about recording this.
So this is one that I heard when I was camping a few years later. I went camping. I kind of had one of those, F Society months where I just kind of went off grid and disappeared. And I was doing a little bit of hiking over on the Appalachian Trail, which isn't too far from my house. I had woken up around 2 a.m. to that sound outside of my tent. And, I don't want to get myself in trouble here, but I wasn't really following the rules. I was, you're supposed to camp in designated areas and stuff. And I kind of walked off the trail and found my own spot, kind of secluded from everything, and was out there with just kind of, I had a small fire, cooked up my dinner and it turned in. And then I woke up to that sound. The interesting thing about that too is, because I wasn't at one of the designated camping sites where they usually have bear boxes, like big metal boxes where you can put your food in and lock so the bears don't get to it. I went out and did a bear bag. So, I walked a fair distance away from my camp and strung up my food in a bag between 2 trees about 15 feet up. When I went to retrieve it in the morning, it was gone. It wasn't like you would think if a bear got to it, the only way it would have gotten to it was climbed up the tree, climbed onto this skinny branch that would have broken with the weight of a bear, and then fall into the ground and run away with whatever it could get at, But when you see a bear like going through trash and stuff, they're not like grabbing a trash bag and carrying it away, And when I got there, the bag was completely gone. There wasn't like it didn't look like something was rummaging through anything there. And the string was still up over the tree. And you could tell that the knot I had tied had been untied. Like it wasn't like snapped or ripped, it was clearly untied. Like, when you untie a tight knot, you can see kind of like the folds in the rope still.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it had to be something with thumbs, to be able to untie a knot and walk off with this. It was strange to me. I kind of thought to myself, well, maybe a ranger came by and saw it and, took it down because I wasn't supposed to be where I was. But it was so early in the morning. I got out there around sunrise, and it just seemed unlikely that would have been the case.
Yeah, and I think a ranger, if that happens, they're going to come looking to see who's not where they're supposed to be. That is strange. And the vocal, though, when I first heard it, my immediate thought was, oh, that's a hog. And then I listened to it again. I was like, I don't think that's a hog. Let's take another listen. Yeah, it's weird. I don't have a lot of experience with hogs, but it's strange, man. And you heard this saying walking around your camp?
Yeah, so it kind of, when I hit record on that, I had been listening to it for a little while and was like, oh, maybe I should, my first thought wasn't, oh, get your phone out and record this. And you could hear it kind of walking around. It sounded like almost kind of wandered over and sat next to the fire for a minute, because like I heard something shuffling around, and then it kind of stopped, but you could still tell that it was around. Like it didn't walk away. Like I didn't, hear it walking away. It just kind of walked, stopped for a while, and was making those sounds, and walked around a little bit longer, and then just disappeared into the woods. And I was by myself. I didn't have any gun on me or anything like that, so I kind of was just terrified. I was like, I'm not getting out of this tent. I'm just going to stay right here and as quiet as possible and let whatever this is pass by. The interesting thing is I shared that audio with my cousin. She said it sounds like a horse that is cribbing. That's when they like chew on a fence post and suck in air. I listened to a couple videos of horses cribbing. I had no experience with horses. I've never, honestly, a little bit afraid of them. So, but it was making that sound. I was listening to these horses cribbing sounds, and it's very similar to that. But I was in the woods in the middle of the night. I didn't have a horse with me. So it's interesting that you say hog, because it does have a little bit of a hog sound as well to it.
Yeah, and you might have to answer this one for me, Matt, because I'm not from Connecticut and I don't know it that well. I don't think you guys actually have hogs out there, though.
No, yeah, we don't have wild hogs out here. People have big farms, but not in the middle of the woods, especially right off the Appalachian Trail. So, I can't be certain. It sounded like it was walking around on 2 legs, not 4. No, I can't definitively say yes, this was a Sasquatch, but that coupled with the missing food bear bag that I had tied up really kind of, it irked me in the morning when I found the empty bag, or I found the bag missing, because it was like, was that a Sasquatch just kind of hanging out around my camp? Like I could have gotten hurt, or what? It was scary. I was super uncomfortable, that's for sure.
Yeah, I would imagine, especially when you're out there alone. I think that almost makes it worse, that in that situation you're hearing this thing, and the bear bag thing is really bizarre. That it took, that in this situation, because you didn't actually see it. But I've had many reports of them taking a bear bag. I had a guy on the show one time, and he talked about, they thought it was a guy at first stealing their bear bag, and it ended up not being a guy. But it's very cool audio. I'm glad that you sent it. I'll have to look into that horse cribbing thing. Going back to your property, I know all of this kind of happened in 2014. Has there been anything else that's happened on the property?
Yeah, so going back to that, the same summer, I did have a vocalization that I couldn't identify. We were sitting outside, we had a small campfire going, and the coyotes were going nuts in one corner of the field like coyotes do, which I personally love. I love the sound of coyotes. I think it's kind of cool. But in the opposite corner, there was this crazy, like, scream, howl that I just couldn't place. And the coyotes went dead silent. We didn't hear a peep from them again. And I was actually trying to find it on on an episode you played, I guess a pretty famous Sasquatch call. That's what it sounded like. We have fisher cats around here too, which if you ever heard a fisher cat, man, that is one crazy sound. It's like a woman getting murdered in the woods. It's terrifying by itself, but it's higher pitched, and this had a lower tone to it. And it is just how quickly the coyote, like I wouldn't expect coyotes to react to a fisher cat, and to have them just shut up and just not hear a single peep from them after it was wild. It was just one of those sounds that rips right through you.
Yeah, the audio that I played, was it the Ohio howl? Did it sound like this?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, your experience reminds me of on the Browns property years ago here in Washington State. They had these things running around on their property, but as the sun went down, you'd hear the coyotes just going off, and then you would hear something else, and all the coyotes would shut up. It's very strange. On this property, has there been anything else that's happened, or has this been the bulk of the experiences?
For me, in terms of Bigfoot, yes. Like I did mention to you when we talked previously, I had a UFO sighting that same summer. So that was kind of a wild summer for me out there. A lot of weird stuff was happening. We had a pool on that property, and I was just kind of sitting in the hot tub and looking up at the stars, and this light appeared, which I immediately passed off as, a plane. But it wasn't really moving, or if it was moving, it was coming like straight at me. It kind of got brighter and dimmed down a little bit, got a little brighter, dimmed down a little bit, got a little brighter, and then it'd move a little bit and kind of stop. And then all of a sudden it just shot like this crazy speed and just vanished. And it was like very odd, like, it definitely wasn't an airplane, wasn't a helicopter. Like the flight path of this thing was just crazy, out of this world. I was immediately like, that's got to be a UFO. And I avoided kind of bringing up the topic. Same with the, Bigfoot, like we were talking prior to the speaking now. People in the Northeast can be a little bit condescending and rude and judgmental. And I didn't want to have the rap of being the weirdo who's seen Bigfoot and aliens, So I did keep it to myself. And when I eventually told my brother, he had seen like the exact same thing a couple years prior. Like when I was describing this, he stopped me. He's like, dude, I saw this exact same thing. That was kind of when I was like, okay, that was definitely a UFO. Like it had to be. I don't know what else it could have been.
Yeah, that is weird. Oftentimes on the show, we talk about balls of light. People see these weird lights on their property. Most of the time, is a separate issue. They'll see these weird lights and also see these creatures. When you saw this light, was it more like a ball of light or was it more like a bright craft?
Yeah, no, it was more of a light. I couldn't really make out any shapes to it aside from just like like an orb kind of. But it seemed like it was high up, like, a plane cruising altitude kind of. And from the ground, from where I was, it was probably, I guess, a softball would be a pretty good representation of the size.
Yeah, and I know it's kind of hard to judge size, especially when you're looking up in the sky at something. It is fascinating, though, that people do report these weird lights on their property when Sasquatch seems to be around. And whether they're related or not, I don't know. And I don't think anyone else really truly knows. What I find fascinating about this whole situation is you live near the Appalachian Trail and in an area where a lot of reports do happen. Eyewitnesses will come forward and say, hey, I saw this weird creature out there running around. So it goes on a lot. Makes me wonder, though, all of this kind of took place in 2014. Do you think that they're on the property or do you think that they were just kind of passing through?
So I think, I think the Sasquatch was just kind of passing through. As I mentioned, I'm not far from the Appalachian Trail, which to me just seems like it could be like a, corridor for these creatures. Kind of an easy way to, there's not a lot of people on it. It's pretty isolated and they'd be able to move pretty easily up and down the coast or, through New England and further down south. So I just, I kind of just think this thing happened to wander into my yard, like just out of coincidence. And, there's lots of food around for it and lots of places to hide. And where I'm at, it is pretty secluded. We don't really have any major cities near me. As far as like, I know a lot of people talk about these portals and stuff like that, connecting Bigfoot and, stuff like that with portals and extraterrestrials. I'm not really sure how all that fits together, but it certainly makes you think.
Yeah, it does make you wonder. And there is weird stuff that does get reported. If there is a travel pattern to these things, which I do think that there is, the Appalachian Trail would be a perfect highway. There's a lot of cover, food, and your chances of running into someone are probably pretty slim. It makes me wonder, as far as where do they go? What are they doing? Why does this thing show up and, you have a couple encounters and then nothing happens? Can I ask you, Matt, what do you think Sasquatch is? Kind of what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, a large bipedal figure. I don't think they're necessarily like teleporting places. I know there are people out there who believe that. I personally don't. And just an intelligent species that just has yet to be discovered. I think they are from this planet. I think they, I can't say if they are, evolved kind of from us, we evolved from them, or just, no correlation at all. But there's certainly a lot of aspects that, kind of make this a humanoid kind of species. And I think they're very intelligent. It's kind of hard to, compare it to anything. Like, I feel like it's a lot different than like an ape or a gorilla, but it does have its similarities.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I understand where you're coming from. I think, when people see these things, they look like some sort of non-human primate. I mean, they fit the description, but there's a lot of little details that don't quite add up. When you were talking about its motion, when it was chasing the deer and that real fluid motion, you hear a lot of different eyewitnesses talk about that. I've had Claire and many other eyewitnesses on, but eyewitnesses will describe that real fluid, almost unnatural type motion when they're running or that sort of thing. Can I ask you real quick on this property back in 2014 when all of this was going on? What time of year was it? Was it fall, spring?
Yeah, it was the summertime.
Interesting, the summertime, huh? Yeah, and all of this took place in 2014, and nothing has really happened since. And I agree with you, Matt. Maybe it was just passing through.
Yeah, and I think kind of another reason to maybe why the area isn't as attractive anymore for a species like that is in the last 10 years, we have seen a very large increase in development, especially now with COVID, being 2 hours from New York City, we have all these New Yorkers coming into the area and building big houses and buying up lots of land. And it is starting to kind of turn into what you'd imagine when you think of Connecticut. You were saying earlier, like cities kind of, and not much ruralness. At least my area of Connecticut. I can't really speak for the rest of it, but
Yeah, they seem to kind of live next to humanity, but just on the outskirts. And even here in Washington State, you'll look at old reports and you're like, really? Someone had an encounter there. But 40, 50 years ago, there was probably nothing there. But they do seem to kind of live on the edge of humanity, right on the not too far away, which is strange. Would you want to see another one again?
I would. I know, it's not the brightest thing in the world to go out and look for these. They can be, as people have reported, they can be quite aggressive. So it's not something I would do lightly. I'd probably, have a lot of safeguards in place, but it is something. Yes, I would like to see one again, and I'm sure I'd be singing in a different tune if I had been bluff charged or had like rocks being thrown at me or something like that. If I was threatened during these sightings, I'm sure I'd probably say no. But as of this moment, I got to say, yeah, I would love to see one again.
Yeah, and I get that, Matt. I can totally understand that. And I know all of this happened to you about 8 years ago. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your audio recordings with us and just taking the time to tell us what happened to you.
Yeah, no, it was great talking to you, and I appreciate you having me on.
And that's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. If you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Until next time, everyone.